Well, let's discuss all this further with Fadel Kaboub, an associate professor of economics at Denison University. He joins us now. Great to have you on the show with us, sir. Now, of course, analysts mostly expected to see OPEC stay out of the fray today at that meeting, allowing prices to continue to fluctuate in the market. What are your thoughts on their decision today to ratify that increase of 400,000 barrels a day in April? Is it even significant news to the market right now, given the current crisis between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, thank you for having me back on the show. It is, in fact, significant in the sense that it's not a significant increase in oil production. And we have to look at this with a little bit of historical perspective, going back 2 years ago in the beginning of the pandemic, when OPEC countries essentially cut their collective oil output production by 10 million barrels. And this current 400,000 barrels a day increase per month is trying to get back to pre-pandemic levels. So the fact that OPEC didn't increase its planned increases beyond the agreed upon 400,000 barrels is significant. And here we have to recognize the de facto leader of OPEC, which is Saudi Arabia, and its role in making this decision. Number one, for OPEC countries, Saudi Arabia in particular, the increase in oil prices is to their advantage because they're trying to make up for lost revenue from the last 2 years of the pandemic. So it's not to their advantage to see oil prices rapidly decline, which is what Western Europe and the United States wants to see. Number two, Saudi Arabia is also using its leverage in the oil market in order to apply some gentle pressure on the US to get some geopolitical points out of this, which is primarily the nuclear deal that the US is trying to restart with Iran, which Saudi Arabia sees as its main adversary, to say the least, in the region. So maybe this is the beginning of a series of back and forth pressures and negotiations between OPEC, Saudi Arabia in particular, and Western Europe and the United States.
Quite right, but looking forward, it certainly seems like oil prices are guaranteed to stay high given the situation, especially when you look at the fact that members haven't been able to keep up with the planned production increases in recent months. So would you say there's any confidence that OPEC and its allies will be able to raise oil production faster going forward? What do you expect to happen there?
So this is a political decision for OPEC. If they wanted to increase production, they could. Will it be sufficient to completely substitute for Russian exports? Not necessarily. And this is something that is very important for people to recognize, because it's not about finding alternative substitute for Russian oil or substitute for Saudi oil or OPEC oil, because we do have other sources of output in Canada and the US and elsewhere, but it's really the quality of the output, not just the quantity. And this is something that a lot of consumers of oil have been complaining about, especially in India and China, saying, yes, you're shipping us all of this volume, but the quality in terms of the energy intensity, the petrochemical composition of the shale oil especially, is not as high as the Saudi, as the Russian oil. So a lot of the consumers are really paying attention to the grade of petroleum that they're buying, not just the volume.
Well, then, what do you make of the fact that the International Energy Agency came out saying that it'll deploy about 60 million barrels from its emergency oil stockpiles? What does this indicate? Does it mean that there's something pretty serious going on in energy markets right now?
Well, it's actually, if anything, it's a sign of how desperate the situation is on the part of European countries in particular, because 60 million barrels, that's the equivalent of 6 days of Russian production. That's the equivalent of 10 days worth of Russian exports. So it's really not going to change the balance of power, so to speak, in the economy. It's a Band-Aid solution to a much deeper crisis. It's clearly a geopolitical crisis, a diplomatic crisis that spilled into an economic crisis. And what tips the balance here in terms of the geopolitical situation is the fact that Europe is heavily dependent on Russian oil and especially Russian gas, and that the alternatives in terms of renewables haven't been built, and the alternative supply lines for natural gas in particular in Western Europe are just not there. For example, pipelines, most of the pipelines that are coming from North Africa, that are coming from the eastern part of Europe, from Russia, they're already at capacity and they're not going to be able to step up and substitute for Russian gas. And number two, LNG, liquefied natural gas, which can be transported and shipped without pipelines, is number one, more expensive. Number two, it requires the regasification of natural gas once it arrives on shore. And the European capacity for gasification of LNG imports from other parts of the world is just not there to substitute for Russian gas. So this is really the tricky situation here, which is where you see the sanctions on the Russian economy very carefully setting the oil and gas industry apart from the rest of the Russian economy, which means in the long term, they're really ineffective because there is no substitute, and the substitute requires substantial investment in infrastructure, hopefully in renewables, but even if it's in natural gas or LNG facilities to import from places like Qatar or other places, the infrastructure is not going to pop up overnight, and it's going to be very expensive to put in place in the first place.